Well, hi everyone. Thank you very much for coming. It's a pleasure to see so many people interested in Warren. Thank you again for putting together this wonderful exhibition. I think it's long overdue that the world takes a greater interest in Warren's ideas and all the interesting things that he was working on, both in the 60s and 70s and later in his career. I think it's as Nicholas Negroponte, who's one of these big visionaries of technology and a mentee of Warren's, told me he is an undiscovered gem. So that's the expression that Negroponte used, and I agree. Since we have such a mixed audience and crowd here, some of you are probably in the academic world, some of you may be activists, some of you might just have a personal connection to Warren. I'll try to go for a format that would not be too heavy on analysis and historical and intellectual detail, but would still try to give you some tangible idea, especially about some of the technological projects that Warren was working on in the 60s. It predates, in some way, Earthchild, which, as you heard, was published in 1974. But in a sense, it's very consistent and coherent with it, because parts of Earthchild, or at least ideas in Earthchild, they already germinated while he was working on his first book, Changing the Family. So to some extent, many of the ideas of Earthchild were already kind of bubbling up in his head throughout the 60s. I know that you have some biographical materials about Warren in the exhibition, and there are flyers and whatnot. I don't know if all of you have had a chance to read them. So maybe I'll just give you a very quick kind of crash course. With 100 years, there cannot be such a thing as a quick crash course to someone's life, but I'll try to focus on some decades, at least, mid-50s to maybe early 70s, at least to situate you and to make sure we're all on the same page, what happened and how these ideas emerged and why they were so important. So I think a good place to start would be maybe mid to late 1950s, where Warren essentially wears several hats. He is one of the pioneers of family therapy, working in a couple of really cutting-edge projects where entire families live on premises of hospitals. And on the assumption that in order to understand problematic family members, you need to look at the entire family and you need to observe them, because what they tell you and what they say does not necessarily map out on what is really happening in the family. So there is this kind of layer of suspicion about what really each family member is telling you, and to go beyond that suspicion, to really understand what is harming them, you really need to start analyzing them together as a unit, but you also need to be doing it for a very long time. So some of those families lived on premises, as I said, for several years, right? And they would engage in daily and weekly meetings with staff, of which Warren was one of the senior members. And out of that emerges one of Warren's first big original insights. It's that you have to look at things holistically. Right? One of his favorite phrases now, but also then, was that there is more to a hand than just 5 fingers. Right? That there is more that emerges from this kind of systemic nature of objects and systems than just the individual components. And you need to have procedures, ways of observing, ways of kind of getting to these hidden rhythms that ordinary language might not provide you. At the same time, Warren is also, of course, continuing some of the work he's been doing in child psychiatry, and he is also training to become a psychoanalyst. So he is undergoing formal training in Psychoanalytic Institute in Washington. So this is late 1950s. He has an affiliation with an entity called Washington School of Psychiatry. And Washington School of Psychiatry at the time, they are famous for challenging some of the basic, well, I wouldn't say challenging, but maybe questioning some of the standard orthodox assumptions of Freudian psychoanalytic therapy, of psychoanalytic theory. So they don't think that it's all just about your inner drives, and it's not just about what's happening inside you, and it's not just about, you know, the dust drive or your libido. You have to situate people socially. You have to situate them in a certain context. In the context of the family, it might require situating them not just vis-a-vis their parents, but also their grandparents and great-grandparents. So they would be mapping this very complex, what they call genograms, to understand all this background to how certain problems come about. That is not about individuals, it's about historic, systemic, social, and cultural issues, right? And it's from that, from our interaction, from our I wouldn't say interactivity, but intersubjectivity, that our psychic problems develop. So in order to be able to resolve them, you also need to get this handle on the social dimension, right? And initially, as I've said, the family is one of these components, right? It's one of the factors in this more social perspective on problems of individuals. But eventually Warren and many of the other people associated with the Washington School of Psychiatry, and they're not just psychiatrists, by the way. For example, one of Warren's closest collaborators at the time is an anthropologist called Edward T. Hall, who essentially studies culture, right? And he tries to understand how different cultures differ from each other in terms of how they perceive space or how they perceive time, and how these differences in perception and the importance of space and time to each of these cultures, how then shapes personal interactions, right? So they would point to, I don't know, for example, Italians or people from the Southern Europe, and they would say that these are very high context cultures, where, okay, you might be saying things, but the actual meaning of what is being said, it's shaped by these hidden rhythms and rituals of culture. Right? How close you are staying to the person, how much you are touching them, whether you're looking them directly in the eye. This is the kind of hidden background or the hidden dimension, as Edward T. Hall called it in the title of one of his books, that shapes communication. And that the language in itself, it doesn't really carry all that much because it needs to be deciphered in that particular high context, right? And that particular very peculiar setting. But then there are also low context cultures. And in that case, it would be many Anglo-Saxon cultures where language does carry most of the meaning, and it's not about understanding the body language or understanding, you know, how people touch each other, because they don't. And it doesn't carry much of a hidden meaning at all. And those would be low context cultures, right? And ultimately, again, I'm just trying to draw your attention to a very radical departure from how traditionally, at least after Freud, psychiatrists and psychoanalysts thought about problems and their genesis, right? And how they are to be solved. Here, in the kind of more social, environmental, and I would even say ecological school that Warren affiliates himself with in the early 1960s, it's all about the social, it's all about the cultural, it's all about the historical. So from there, Warren starts experimenting, which is a very crucial event in his life. He starts doing experiments with talented blind individuals. And this is a very interesting project that got started in the early 60s by the Kennedy administration, which wanted to bring in partly, you know, some of the disabled people who they thought should be working for the government, but also people with extra talents who were needed in order to be able to help America win the Cold War. So in this case, the assumption that drove this project, where Warren had a minor part on the sidelines of it, was that talented blind people would be able to perceive in, for example, words that they hear, or in an audio tapes that they hear, certain things that sighted people cannot. In part because of their blindness, they managed to develop extra talents, and through those extra talents, they managed to use their sense of touch, or their sense of smell, or their, smell, right, or taste in order to kind of break through the usual limits that all of us face when it comes to perception. So as crazy as it sounds, the CIA actually had a group of such young, talented people who were blind, whom they were teaching Russian for a number of years in Washington, and those people would be listening to intercepted Soviet communications in order to be able to essentially help the CIA to detect certain maybe unperceived processes or activities that were included in those audio files. I've read a memoir written by one of them, and from what I understand, they had a lot of psychological problems. It was a very intense program. They had to learn Russian, they had to live in Washington on their own, and mind you, they were blind. And I think Warren got to that project, or was kind of inserted into it partly, or the CIA didn't mind him talking to them, in part because they needed some counseling. But Warren started using those sessions as a way of learning more about, first of all, how these blind people manage to develop the capacity to perceive so much more than the rest of us, and then trying to understand how those capacities can be replicated in all of us, so that you don't have to be blind in order to be able to smell or taste or touch in richer, multidimensional ways. Right? And that got Warren by roughly 1964 to a point where he understood that maybe computers would be of some help in trying to detect all these hidden rhythms, all these hidden dimensions that structure our communication, and by making them explicit, by making them visible to participants in those exchanges, they would be able to master them. Right? And this again, to give you an example that might make it clear, think about space, like built space, rooms, right? Certain rooms, because of the way they're built, because of how high the ceilings are, what kind of wall isolation they have, how much light they get, how warm they are, whether there is heating, they essentially open themselves up to either more or less perception, especially if you're blind. Clearly, if you have a room that has windows, and windows are bright and big like here, there will be more heat coming in, or there will be other types of cues coming in, and through those cues you will be able to kind of get a richer picture of what's happening, right? And as you make those extra criteria and extra dimensions explicit, as you make them visible, you would be able to maybe start manipulating the environment. You would be able to build different, to make it easier for the blind people to perceive more. Or if you understand what those hidden dimensions are for the sighted people, you would be able to make sure that even they, that is all of us who can see, can perceive in richer ways. So environments themselves can become more dynamic. They can become more plastic, and as you make them more plastic, you can make them in such a way that our hidden capacities and our hidden potentialities, they get realized, right? And that's a big kind of insight that leads and drives Warren to go to MIT and try to understand how computers, sensors, and all sorts of modern technologies can be harnessed in order to essentially create or kind of spearhead what he at the time calls human enhancement, right? And it's a very unfortunate brand because it got immediately read as some kind of an effort to build super people or Superman, and just 2 decades after the end of the Second World War, of course, a lot of people faced this with resistance, because they thought that this is some kind of a strange, weird project to experiment on people. But at its core, all he wanted to do was to essentially make sure that all of us can develop all of the capacities and capabilities that we have, but that somehow gets suppressed by industrial civilization, capitalism, mass production, and industrial society in general. Because the kind of environments that nurture us and rear us, they are all standardized, and they're not at all built in such a way as to bring out all these things we are capable of. Right, and as Warren faces these problems with implementing this human enhancement agenda at MIT, he, through various connections and brokers, he runs into a very rich and powerful individual, actually the great grandson of John D. Rockefeller, at one point the richest man in the world, who essentially gives Warren and four more people, and the fifth was this individual himself, Peter Ozer, some money in order to start an 18 months experiment where this kind of project, some of them grounded in Warren's idea of human enhancement, some of them grounded in their shared interest in ecology, some of them grounded in a very different approach to artificial intelligence, can take shape and where they can experiment on them. And this is how in 1967, Warren, together with these five colleagues, launched something called the Environmental Ecology Lab, which finds itself in Boston, on Boston's waterfront, at a place called Lewis Wharf, where for 18 months, they, and with a lot of resources, they get two very expensive computers, they create a fantastic space, they, just to give you an example, they put the back of an old Ford car inside the lab, right? As a place where you can go in and kind of sit and reflect and have a conversation. And they have a parachute on the ceiling. I mean, the whole place is an extremely creatively arranged environment, which is meant or was meant to awaken people to the boredom and dreadiness of the industrial world outside. So the whole point of you walking into that space was to make you aware of just how unfulfilling and underperforming our usual environments are. So to cut the story short, and I want to talk about three specific projects from that lab, because this is where I think the actual technical legacy of Warren Brodey is. But from there, as they kind of fight with each other and they meet resistance from the industry, and they don't want to necessarily take money from the military because they are all very concerned about the Vietnam War, Warren and his main collaborator, a guy called Avery Johnson, they end up moving their operation from that lab on Boston waterfront to the middle of the woods in New Hampshire, a place called Milford, where Avery Johnson, who also was a very rich individual, had an abandoned quarry with a beautiful lake, which you might see in the film that's being played at the exhibition. And there, this venture gets reinvented as ecology tool and toy, where they mostly limit themselves to, I would say, physical and not so much digital or technological artifacts. They do try to build toys, but most of the kind of advanced computer-driven, sensor-driven work that they were doing at the lab, it kind of gets sidelined a little bit. And this is where it's true that Warren's work takes a more ecological, nature-driven, nature kind of focused direction. So what I thought I can do in the remaining time is maybe to illustrate, because I've given you some ideas that I needed to give you this narrative, but far from all of them, and many of them are extremely interesting and useful. So what I thought I would do, I would just talk about three projects that they try to build at the lab. And I will try to maybe illustrate how the core philosophy behind them was very different from the kind of logic and philosophy that informs our technologies today. And I wish I could show you photos or videos, but maybe you'll see some of them in the films. So the first project I wanted to mention is a dancing suit that they were building at the lab. And this dancing suit was very peculiar in that it had sensors in it. It was, think about it as a full body leopard of some kind with sensors and elastic bands on like your joints, so on the elbows, on the knees, and so forth, which with sensors connected to, think about it as a small analog computer, which was capable of making music, right? So it was a dancing suit, but it was also an artifact that could actually affect the music that you were dancing to, right? So the whole point here, it was not about build some kind of a suit that would allow you to jump higher or, perform some kind of magic moves that you couldn't do before. The goal here was not higher efficiency or better performance. The goal of this particular experiment was to allow the dancer to explore the mutual entanglement, if you will, of movement and sound as dance unfolds, right? And this is what they meant by the word ecology when they used the term ecology at the lab. It wasn't necessarily something related to nature, but it was about processes that were complex, that were non-linear, that were mutually affecting each other, and that didn't have a linear trajectory of some kind and didn't have a predictable outcome, right? And in this case, clearly, to be able to even operationalize and do something meaningful with that suit, right? You need to be able to cultivate some kind of understanding, some kind of taste, some kind of skill, right, in what it is you're trying to do. So you need to show judgment. You need to discern what it is that counts as a good dance move and a good music to go along with that, and you need to be able to distinguish it just from random noise patterns, right? And the whole goal of this experiment, of this project, if you will, was to essentially put the human user, or the human, in the loop, at the center, but without assuming that you know what that human user wants, right? And without assuming that the human user themselves know what they want. So you give them the ability to explore what it is that they want by giving them the tools to experiment, so they can actually move one way and generate one kind of music, they can move another way and generate another kind of music. But the whole premise about the user at the center of such efforts was that we are capable of learning and becoming someone else. And technology is there to help us in that mission. And by kind of making all of these parameters of becoming, if you will, more visible and explicit, you can help people achieve that mission. Right? And I think that this is an extremely different paradigm from how we traditionally think about technology, where technology is just an instrument given to a fully rational actor who knows what they want, and we just need to give them something with which they can accomplish that. Right? So it's almost a homo economicus kind of model from economics, but transposed to the world of technology. In their case, it was kind of homo ecologicus, if you will. You start with somebody who finds themselves in an extremely complex environment, right? And there is clearly some kind of an inner growth happening in us as we take on all these experiments. We have certain desires, ambitions, we have certain interests, which affect what kind of moves we make and what kind of music we generate, and there is some kind of taste inherent to us. But there is also the external environment outside. There is, if somebody is watching us, there is the public reacting to how we perform. There is the weather patterns outside. There is maybe sun, or maybe rain, or maybe snow. Why shouldn't those things somehow be affecting our use of technology? Why should this external environment be excluded? Right? So in a sense, the way they thought about technology was as an interface, as some kind of a middle ground between the outer ecology of the entire planet and all of the processes that were unfolding around us, both social and natural ones, but also all of the inner processes that were happening inside us. Right? And technology was this intermediate layer where this outer and inner parts met. And again, if you think about the way we traditionally think about any of the objects, any of the technologies, they don't incorporate that outer or inner dimension at all. They're just made once for certain use, and and you use them, and maybe you hack them and do something else with them, right? This is what kind of Silicon Valley developed as a way to talk about these modifications. We hack artifacts. But by and large, technologies are not supposed to make us reflect upon the kind of effects that they generate on the world, right? These effects, they might come 25 years later. There is no need to make them immediate now. What they were trying to do is to make those effects immediate now, so that as you're learning how to use technology, and as you're deliberating what to use it for, the entirety of effects, ecological effects included, are made visible to you at the moment, right? Which again is a radical departure from how traditionally we think about the instrumental nature of technology. The second artifact from the lab that I want to talk about, or at least a project that I don't think that the second one, the suit actually existed. So in one of the films you can see the only lady in the lab wearing it. I don't think it's in the Quarry film, it's in the other film from the lab. The second artifact that they tried to build goes back to Warren's time in state psychiatric hospitals, which was shortly after he got his MD in Toronto and moved to America. He had a brief stint in Worcester State Hospital in Massachusetts, which was a pretty depressive place where they really used a lot of old school methods, including shock therapy, to essentially treat patients. And Warren described it to me and to others in various interviews as essentially a prison but without due process. People ended up there for decades. They couldn't leave. There was, the doctors played the role of judges. I mean, it was essentially a mess. And he was asked repeatedly to administer shock therapy to young patients, and he refused several times. So that's just to give you a background of how he felt about the consensus, in the medical profession circa mid-1950s. So one of the projects they developed at the lab was a very interesting, you can call it responsive restraint blanket, which instead of chaining patients to the bed who are violent, instead of chaining them to the bed with steel cuffs of some kind, right, or steel handles, right, they would actually design a blanket that would change shape and form and how loose it is based on how much the patient is trying to escape it. Right? So essentially, if they put such a blanket on you, and if you are lying quietly, the blanket is more or less loose, so you can move around and you don't feel restrained. If you start really kind of trying to break out of it, the friction that you generate by moving your body parts, it heats up the materials inside the blanket expands, and thus the space that you have underneath it contracts, and essentially your movement gets constrained as well. So you kind of learn as you are experimenting with different attitudes towards the system, if you will, how much of a rebel to be. I mean, I would say it's in this particular case, you can write entire books to kind of speculate to what extent this type of flexible control is something that we want, or whether it's something that kind of repackages the old paradigm, under new packaging. But I want to kind of leave that question aside and just focus on the process. And the process of touch or heat generating responses in the materials that you're interacting with, it became one of the key big agenda items for the lab. So they first called it flexware as a kind of middle ground between hardware and software. They started speculating about what this kind of materials might do in other domains. Could you make responsive chairs that would somehow be responding to the user, the way the blanket responds to the patient? Can you be making responsive baby bottles? Can you be making furniture that would change shape as it is exposed to sunlight, right? Of course, or can it change shape as it is exposed to touch? Or can you connect these materials to a computer and have some kind of a computer-operated heater that would be able to bring this substance? And I skipped one important step in explaining this to you. They were using a very specific substance to turn liquid into gas, right? And that happened at a certain temperature, which was more or less under certain kind of conditions equal to the temperature of human touch. So that's why you could change shape just by touching these objects. But you could easily imagine a scenario, and they actually did, where you could connect sensors, not necessarily sensors, but you can connect computers to heat-controlled. I'm mixing it up. You can connect computers to heaters that would be programmed, right, from the computer. So you can say, okay, now I want to bring up this material to 60 degrees, or in 60 degrees it will change shape. Right? And this idea of responsiveness and of responsiveness on demand became very big to their vision. So when you look at this anthology that is put together as part of the exhibition, you will see that in one of the manifestos they're talking about telephones that will change shape as you touch them. So as you pick up the telephone, it will take the shape of your hand. Or if you take a cup, it will take the shape again of your hand. All of this, you have to understand why, because it might also seem frivolous. Why should we care about cups that adapt themselves to our particular fingers? It had to do, again, with this very environmental, social, and cultural analysis of how our psychic problems and our sense of becoming, if you will, how it's shaped by environment. And the idea that the environments that were mass produced by industrial civilization, they were not really bringing out all these vast talents in us, the way that they were not bringing out all the sensory potential in us, as I was explaining before with the blind, right? So the idea was that by giving people the ability to create objects and environments that were responsive to them, you would be able to get them out of this box that industrial capitalism of the 1960s put them into, right? That more or less was the idea, but you have to understand that, and that's a mistake that a lot of people make when thinking about it. They drew, and Warren especially, a very big difference between what they called responsiveness and what they called adaptiveness. Adaptiveness was making sure that something becomes perfect, right? That it's kind of gets personalized to you. Right? Where you take this cup or this telephone that I was describing before, even this responsive chair or the responsive mattress. The idea behind adaptiveness is that the only criterion that matters is how efficient or pleasant it is. Right? That's what adaptiveness is. They didn't want adaptiveness. They wanted responsiveness. And responsiveness there, the main criterion was how much you can learn from this process of interacting with the artifact. So the idea, and again, you can see how Warren's psychiatric and psychoanalytic practice kind of informs this, because in a way, that's what a good analyst and psychiatrist does, right? They make you aware of certain problems and parameters and processes in your own life, so that once you've rendered them explicit, you can learn something and choose a different path and walk in a different directions. In a way, all these responsive, intelligent environments and objects that Warren wanted to build, that's my interpretation of what he wanted, was in a way a transfer of that function from the psychoanalyst and psychiatrist who tries to kind of steer you by making certain things explicit towards a better path, that's what they were expecting of the objects. Right? So the idea, again, just to kind of drive this message home, it's not about finding the perfect position for the mattress or for the chair. It's about making you aware that there is more space for maneuver, that there are more decisions that you can make, that you don't have to accept the music you're dancing to, you can actually change the music by dancing. No, but I'm literally like, that was what they wanted. It was showing you that there is so much more in these hidden structures and rhythms of everyday life that we can be changing, that we aren't, and because we aren't, we get stuck. And the final project that I just want to mention is something that they call Telegrasp, and they built some prototypes of it. And it has to do with applying many of these insights, this idea that environments determine who we are and how we act, to the world of computing. And the critique that they had was that essentially computers of that era, of the 1960s, they expected us to be very limited human beings. We could only communicate with them through through keyboards, right? The mouse wasn't even kind of a big thing yet, even though it was invented kind of in 1968. And there was no other way to interact with computers, right? So you could only type things in, but all the other senses, our sense of touch, of smell, of eyesight to some extent, our hearing, they were not in any way utilized by the computers of that period. And they felt really bad about it because they thought that sooner or later it's going to kind of dumb us down, because as the computer civilization takes on, the fact that the interfaces are so limited and one-dimensional is going to result in users who are sensorially poor. Right? And this is why they started developing and experimenting with interfaces that would engage more than just one sense. So it would not just be about typing, but it would be about typing, which is actually language, right? Because keyboards of that period, they were not giving you any haptic feedback. They were not acting back on you in any way. So even what passed for touch wasn't really touch. You were just inputting text. They thought it was horrible, so they were trying to find ways in which you can bring eyesight, hear, smell not so much, touch, all to the world of interfaces. And one of the interesting projects they built was this thing called Telegrasp, where the idea was that you would take two boxes, think of them as shoe boxes maybe, right? Where you would be able to stick your hand inside, and what you'll feel inside would be some kind of, balloonish kind of material. So it will be soft, a little bit like those chairs or mattresses that would be adapting to you. It would be made from the same materials. And as you stick your hand, you would be able to kind of, touch or grasp what's inside the box. And there would be sensors inside the box. And the person who is sticking their hand in the second box, and they can be separated by distance, they don't even have to be in the same room, would essentially come to feel the kind of grasp that you are exercising in one box, they will feel it in the second. So it will be kind of a handshake at a distance, where the kind of really peculiar aesthetic personal touch that you're putting into a handshake would be felt and communicated at a distance. So that the kind of personal touch and the personal flavor that you're adding to communication would be finally made explicit in a way that computers of 1960s could never deliver. Right? And again, it might seem kind of exotic, but if you think about it, it's completely consistent with their overall philosophy, much of it again coming from Warren's experiments with the blind, his work in psychiatry, his work in psychoanalysis, but not only. I mean, I don't want to say that this lab was just Warren's ideas. I mean, other people brought quite a lot to the table too. But they did have, I think, a very coherent approach, which did problematize technology not just as a tool or an instrument, the way we normally think about technology, but technology as an environment, right? As Warren in one point, he says that he wants to think of technology as something that we bathe in, B-A-T-H, right? So it's really like taking a bath and being surrounded by technology and technological artifacts and technological systems. You know, and a bath can be cold, it can be hot. There are all sorts of ways in which a bath can be different. So as opposed to taking an object and trying to carve things with it, or trying to take a hammer and, you know, nail a hammer and nail. For them, the whole point was to make sure that when you pick a hammer, there is no concrete set of rules or instructions that follows. You know, if you want to play jazz with that hammer and you have the environments and technologies to learn how to do that, you know, be their guest. If you want to scratch your back with that and you know how to do that, right? It was essentially the suspension of any script, cultural but also physiological one, because you could actually learn new skills that society and physics bakes into our built environment and our built artifacts. And in that sense, it's an extremely creative, subversive, radical paradigm, which also circumvented a lot of, or at least navigated around a lot of stumbling blocks in debates about artificial intelligence of that period, because they were solving very different problems. And I don't want to go into AI now, but you can clearly see that the kind of radical subversion that they wanted to do, it's very different from the normal debate that was happening in AI at the time. And you know, there is a reason why I mentioned a hammer, because it's a very big example and a big argument in AI debates of that period, of the late 1960s, where one group of people, essentially, let me just paint to you this picture quickly. There are essentially three camps at the time, and these guys are probably the fourth one. One camp says that, look, hammering, it's very simple. We can just reduce it to algorithms, and then we can build AI that will just follow the rules, and it will say, okay, this is a nail, this is a hammer, you pick up the hammer, and you nail the nail, and the problem is solved. So you're essentially prescribing the rules, and you are prescribing the algorithms for how a certain process, in this case hammering, is to be done. A second group, which is kind of closer to how ChatGPT works, says that forget about the rules, forget about specifying anything explicitly, forget about teaching the system. We're just going to dump a lot of photos and videos of people hammering, and the system will eventually learn how to hammer. It might not know what hammering is if you don't teach it the language, but it would kind of understand what it is that you need to do with a hammer and a nail, because it has absorbed millions of videos and photos of hammering, right? And then there is a third group, which were philosophers who read a lot of Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty, and they said, oh, forget about it, hammering is too complex. It's based on tradition. You really need to be a Bavarian farmer to understand what it's like to hammer. And there is an entire 5,000-year tradition that teaches you about wood and cows and barns, and we will never be able to teach it to artificial intelligence, right? And these were the debates in AI that carried on for 3 or 4 decades. This guy said, hammer, whatever, right? If you want to turn it into a musical instrument, you do it. If you want to, scratch your back with it, you do it. If you want to create an artistic performance with it, you do it. This is how they get to the idea of toys. That's what toys do. They suspend these pre-written scripts that society and physics and nature builds into artifacts, right? And you don't necessarily know how to operationalize that, right? But neither did the philosophers who were talking about Heidegger, right? Because the philosophers' program was defeatist. It was to say, forget about AI, nothing to be done here. Whereas the projects of the Environmental Ecology Lab, they took it one step further. And they started thinking about how, by providing and building information into artifacts and objects, you can actually create more intelligent human beings. So that you can learn more skills, so that you can develop the kind of taste and judgment and skills and understandings that you will find new uses to artifacts, and you maybe would even want to do new things that you never wanted before. So in a sense, it was a project that was very different to the standard research agenda in artificial intelligence, because their goal was to eventually create more sophisticated humans, which is how it loops back to human enhancement I was talking about before, right? And you create smarter, more intelligent humans by giving them the tools to learn new skills, but not just skills, right? It's not about augmenting humans the way traditional computer scientists thought about it. It's about giving us the ability to discern meaning where previously no meaning was available because everything seemed like noise, right? And that's why, if you go to the opera for 15 years, you would be able to hear something in a musical piece that you wouldn't hear if you go there for the first time, right? And that's their understanding of skill. It was like that. That essentially by making certain dimensions visible sooner, you would be able to democratize expertise, and you would be able to turn people into connoisseurs through technology and have them read and lead a richer life. And there I think there is so much more that we can be doing, because it completely reorients our current debate about AI away from thinking how do we dump more money on technology companies so that they can build more services to make sure that we become dumber, because they will take off and take over doing all of the things for us and from us, to using all this money to using technology to create smarter, more meaningful, more discerning, more sophisticated human beings. And that I think is a completely different path and a completely different option that few have explored and are even aware that it needs to be explored. Sorry, it's been more than 20 minutes, but I think I've given you a pretty complex landscape. Hopefully, hopefully some of it was absorbed. Thank you.